Hello everyone. The following will be an 80 or so minute conversation which I had with Lokey. Lokey is becoming more and more prevalent in the Souls community for offering translations which clean up a lot of the messy lore of these games. And in this video, we're going over some of the mistranslated lore of Demon Souls, and if you haven't already, I've got to recommend you watch my lore video on it before proceeding, as this is more or less a straight continuation from there, for me at least. Links to Lokey's media spheres are in the description box below, as are links to everything we discuss. I want to thank Lokey for doing this video with me as I came away from our talk, which was actually a sneaky hour and a half longer off mic, with a lot more knowledge on the Souls games than just Demon Souls, and if you want to see what the developers were actually going for, Lokey's translations are about the best resource you have at your disposal. With all of these formalities out of the way, here's our talk. The first thing we want to talk about is just the basic translation, the sort of backstory of the quality work.
Yeah, so when I started on this, it was back when I was working on Dark Souls translation things, and while trying to analyze Dark Souls, I felt it was prudent if I had at least basic knowledge of Demon Souls, and I ended up looking at its script as a result, and, well, what do you know, I found that there were problems in that script as well, and in some places surprising areas, because certain theories regarding Dark Souls end up tying back to Demon Souls and very specific wordings in the localization, and I'm like, oh wait, those wordings don't actually exist. In other ways, though, it didn't change too much, but I ended up falling in love with Demon Souls as kind of a byproduct of all this, and I ended up becoming really in love with the lore, which makes me once again very, very sad that it has problems as well. So,
Yeah.
Not to harp on the localization too hard, but some of these issues are things that are very simple and very basic. Some of these you can understand why there were mistakes. Like, this is something where, like, oh, you could easily misread. Like, there's an entire portion with so I think most people are familiar with this idea that Ostrava refers to Ulan as a he, and then you actually fight the dark spirit and Ulan's a woman. This is something that actually is rather humorous, because the kanji used that Ostrava uses actually is normally read as he, but it also happens to be a way to say that in how should I put it, in like a formal royal speak, so to speak, like sort of like what royal characters would use. So it was intended to be sort of a foreshadowing that Ostrava was kind of a royal in disguise. But what ended up happening was that the localizer probably looked at it, kind of assumed it was supposed to be read as like his barbarian legions or what have you, and then ended up kind of just translating it as that without kind of considering the implications of his actual speech pattern. So we ended up getting stuff like that, and that's completely understandable. But then you get some lines which are like, well, like, how do you go from, like, you could kind of see like kind of where they were going, but you're kind of like, okay, like, this is like completely off base. Like, we're not even trying. Like,
I noticed also there's a lot of naming errors. Like, you have Bito the Moonlit Knight and Vito the Moonlit Knight.
Yeah, that was an interesting one, because this doesn't happen in Dark Souls like it did in Demon Souls, where like you have like instances where official names didn't get checked, and I always wonder what the editor's doing on these scripts.
It's also like Risaya and Lisaya.
Yeah, that's doing so, and you pointed that out in your video quite well, is that there is a BV and LR confusion with Japanese, so you kind of have to pick one and kind of stick with it.
Yeah.
And like usually, like I think for my Reddit post I went with the Bito and Lazaya just to keep it consistent, but the overall, like, I don't know which is proper as the one. Like, the same thing happens with, like, say, Rydell, as he's called in English, but, like, the Japanese is Rydell. And I noticed that there's, like, spelling differences in the American, like, they actually changed it to make it look more like Rydell, how they pronounce it. But, like,
I think they put a Y in there.
Yeah, they put a Y in there somewhere, and then, like, even though, like, the original is just, like, Rydel or something to that effect, so it's, like, it's read, at least in Japanese, as Rydell, Ryderu, and it's, and it's, and I and then I hear the English line, and it's like Rydell, and I'm like, what? And I don't know what the proper one is, because like you have to understand, like sometimes the way that Japanese text will render names, especially particularly foreign names, will not be necessarily how they would be pronounced in English. Like say Cerberus will be pronounced like Kerberos, as in I think the original Greek in doing so, but we wouldn't pronounce it that way in English. And like certain names will end up being kind of rendered how they would be like literally look if you looked from an outsider, but if you knew the language you wouldn't pronounce them that way. So I don't know what's proper for that character, but I could just tell you how it would be actually pronounced in the original language it was written in for the Japanese, basically.
Yeah. I also noticed with I went over all of the translations you did, all of them that were on Reddit, and I forgive like small stuff when the Japanese text, for example, it more blatantly puts it that, for example, the dragon skeleton at the base of Stonefang, it produces dragon ore, whereas in the English it's more kind of inferred that that's what it did. What irks me in going over this is how much stuff was just blatantly changed and how the meaning of things was removed. So, for example, with the Soul Brand and Demon Brand, the descriptions in the Japanese pretty blatantly state that the character tendency system it's not a morality system. It's supposed to be measuring how much you are a demon in the game. That isn't really communicated in the English version.
Well, there's also this general issue that you'll see, like, this is something that also happens, like, say, in Dark Souls, where it looks like sometimes there's a case of, okay, we glanced at it once, and then, I've got to make my paycheck, so I'm just going to write down the first thing that comes to mind and move on, because, I've got, like, a lot of this stuff, it's out of order. Like, you can listen to some of the localizers who will talk about it in interviews, and they certainly, like, they had their own troubles, and I'm not going to fault them for that. It's just that ultimately we end up with the worst quality script, and one of the things that I always get mad is I'm like, well, people get paid for this, so like, like you want to have some quality assurance, but it's neither here nor there. So we could talk about that now. Like, say for example, the monumental is actually quite explicitly stated to be a she at the end. Like, the website profile kind of keeps it ambiguous, but like the ring that you get at the end of, like, I guess what you would call the quest line. I'm not sure if that's really a quest line, so to speak, but like the ring that the monumental ultimately gives you does clarify that it's the quote unquote, like, the small, like, boy-ish looking like statue almost is actually a woman, and which is sort of relevant considering that we have, like, there's the whole notion of witches being like sort of a thing in Demon Souls. There's the maiden in black, who is actually, of course, also a woman, and there's like tons of examples of sort of female characters, especially dating back to like the pre-first Scourge times, that are sort of magic users or prominent or using, and there's like tons of implications you could probably make from that, and that can be lost because you don't have that little key piece of information. And that's a thing with like Souls games that is sort of unique, is that a lot of games where, like, you have large scripts or lots of lore, you could lose something maybe important to like a character or something, but usually there's so much like story like exposited or brought into the game as a whole, that like, one line being a little inaccurate isn't going to like radically affect your understanding of the game. But in Souls games, like, you don't have too much being exposited to you directly. So like that one line, if it's the wrong line, can really have a cascading effect on your understanding of everything that goes on in the lore.
Yeah. A good example of that is actually with the Northern Regalia. In the English version, it says that it was left in the world for malicious purposes, whereas in the Japanese version, I believe it said it was left in the world due to malice, or something like that.
Yeah, so like it's particularly vague, and the implication is the opposite of what the English goes with, is that, like, sort of whatever, like, malice, like, because malice existed in the world, And malice is something that's very explicitly used in the script, much more compared to the English. You kind of
Yes.
point that out to some extent with the idea of like Latria and the Valley of Defilement, sort of showing their different ideas of evil. But the idea of malice is very explicit, and right down to like the final encounter with Allant, um, it's very clear that the Miyazaki wanted to kind of deliver this idea of malice, what it is, and how it's relevant to the idea of souls and sort of the human condition overall, which is again another idea he carried
Yes.
over to Dark Souls.
And the Northern Regalia in the Japanese version, it reads as a bit more sort of a hopeful tool.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Whereas, this is a tool to solve malice rather than this is a tool that's here because of malice.
yeah, exactly. And Ostrava, there's also a line where Ostrava, like I think it's something when he's talking about the legend, and there was an error to that effect where when Ostrava is like talking about the sword and talking about the legend, and you want to get sort of clarifications on what exactly is being said, you still have you still have problems because it's like, all right, so let's take um Latria for example. When it talks about like the queen threw out her old husband, like doing so, and
Yes.
everyone I've seen comes up with a theory revolving around, okay, did she cheat? Did he cheat on her? Was there
Yeah.
like this big scandal? Was it doing so? And like
Was Lord Rydell the new husband? Is that why
exactly,
he's
like
in there?
there's there's everyone tries to come up and tries to work around it, and that's what you should do because that's how Miyazaki likes the lore, is to try to set you up with give you all the information, and you kind of have to infer and put together as it's doing so. But it turns out it's actually quite simple. It's like, well, no, they're not husband and wife. Like, it's never, no husband is ever mentioned in relation to the queen.
No.
The quote unquote once royal mistress just calls him, oh, he's just this just execrable old man. Like, it's just this. The idea is just that he's just this terrible old guy that
Yeah.
that the queen got rid of. Now, you could argue because the implication with the way that they're referring to old man, they're referring to someone who's like respected, someone who's kind of sagacious, like sort of like a Freck figure, like sort of like you're a wise old man. Freck is more
Yeah.
like middle age-ish,
Sort of a sage.
but like that's kind of the idea, is that um the old monk is not really a monk so much as he's like a sage. He's some sort of wise man.
An elder.
Yeah, an elder. And the implication would then be, okay, well, we know that like there's imagery, for example, of like old men sort of like around the queen, etc. Like that's like something that
Yeah.
you see in like the stained glass and stuff like that. So like that kind of gives you an idea of kind of the type of environment that Latria had, of like, you have like your queen who sort of has this like holy aura around her, and then you have like all these noble old advisors, etc., or elders that are kind of around there, and all of them are now studying magic, of course, but like the general idea seems to be is like there was this kind of like royal court of like kind of old guard that were sort of advising her, perhaps, and then
Yes.
maybe he was one of those people. We don't like that's something you can
Yeah.
infer about, but it has nothing to do with them being married.
No.
Exactly.
It,
So
it reads, knowing this now, it reads a lot more to me that because I theorized that he's a member of the Soul Society, or was in some capacity. See, now it doesn't have to be that, well, her husband was a member of it. Now it's just that,
yeah, and that's
now
and
it's
that's
just
the
that
point.
this advisor of hers, they were all studying magic because that they were like this really learned country. They were just studying the soul arts, and he was a bit more depraved. He was kind of like Frake, where he was talking about, we should embrace the demons, and then he's just thrown out.
Yeah, and that's actually something that's really brought up, is that you can see like all of like Latria items are sort of like, well, not all of them, but like sort of a lot of key ones related to the nobility make a point about how they have like the evil eye ring effect, where like you kill an enemy and you'll get extra souls from it. So like they help
Yes.
you collect souls. But then when you get to the old monk boss, his soul gives you thirst, which actually sort of, it makes the item makes a point of saying that it has the same effect as those items, but it takes it to its limit, and it points out that it gets to the point where it looks no different from the works of demons. And
Yeah.
that's very relevant because it sort of gives you an idea, okay, well, what type of person was this guy? Like, now he's obviously become an actual demon, but was he doing stuff like this beforehand? Was he already someone who was like, sort of beyond, like he was going beyond the pale as a human being?
Yeah.
And I theorize it has something to do with like what we see him doing in the present, which is like human experimentation and things like that. Um, but the general gist would be, okay, well, if this guy was just like sort of someone who is just sort of, okay, everyone was sort of like, you know, everyone was sort of kind of greedy and wasteful and like, you know, these sort of like elitist high society members who like were debaucherous, but he took it a step too far that even they were like, okay, yeah, sorry, like we're not cool with that. um yeah, it has to be something serious to that effect. And that's something that
Yeah.
you can think of, and none of it has to do with being the queen's husband and like stuff like that. In fact, you actually
Yeah.
made this interesting point about the idea of like the mercury stone and like maybe they were giving them mercury stone. And actually I was actually surprised because I had to go back to check, but yeah, in the Japanese text of mercury stone, the shard, it actually quite explicitly states that in Latria the stone was being given to the prisoners little by little. So that's
Oh.
actually there quite. So congrats on your inference. It's actually right there in the text. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know about the for brain damaging because it's all there's also a line where the royal mistress I'm just gonna say it because it's easy. So once royal mistress is actually a former noble's wife, and that's one of the points I make in my post is that most
Yeah.
instances of royal in the script, and this happens in the original Dark Souls too, and it's somewhat obnoxious, is that most instances of royal is actually noble, and they sort of get automatically like kind of upgraded, I guess. So like the once royal mistress is really a former noblewoman. She was once the wife of nobility, as she describes herself. And then, so when she talks about what's going on with all of them, she very specifically says that, like, I think in English it's something like feeding off their souls, but in the Japanese text it's very clear they're like squeezing them out, like, you know, you're giving them the squeeze
Yeah.
and they're trying to siphon them out, and eventually they get so brain dead they're willing to believe that, oh my god, our wife is immortal, our queen is immortal, she resurrects no matter what, like, yay, holy bee, which is quite twisted for the old monk that he basically can like kill the queen technically again and again as much as he wants, and everyone's gonna cheer it on.
Yeah. And
uh,
then they're drip fed that ridiculous lie that they can be saved by those by going to the upper
well,
levels
yeah,
and
and,
all that.
that's the point is that like the Japanese script is very clear because there's this line that the once royal mistress says in the English version to the effect of where she talks about how like the idea is that the queen will apparently resurrect any number of times, and then the English has this very strange byline. One sec, let me any number. Here we go. And she says, like, I know the truth, the church goddess may die, but never for long, and we are trapped below forever. And it's like, well, what? Okay, like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, why, like, I'm glad, like, what's the random commentary? But the
Yeah.
Japanese text is very clear in that she's saying, she's already heard from people who came well before, so, like, other prisoners and stuff who are like, you gotta hear, you gotta see this. The church's goddess will resurrect as many, like, whatever, as many times as it takes. That's why there can't be any ordinary humans going above, because in her point is that like you have to be insane if you actually
Mm.
believe this tripe. And the reason why she's selling some of her stuff in exchange for souls is because she wants to stay sane a little bit longer so she doesn't have to, like, she won't be crazy enough that she'll actually believe the lies and go up above. um
Yeah.
but the actual point about the mercury stone, you're completely right, they are in fact poisoning them by giving some of this like uh melted stuff little by little. I don't know about the tricking them to thinking it's silver, but one thing to note is that mercury in Japanese, the kanji are literally is water silver basically. So that's something worth noting.
Yeah. Also, as for Rydell being in the jail, I'm wondering from the translations you gave, I get that he's sort of a. See, I thought initially that he may have been some sort of regent in Latria from the translations you gave, it seems that he is sort of a hand of Allant, where he's on like a frontline leader.
Yeah. So one of the thing that got translated out was like they just call him like Lord Rydell in
Yeah.
descriptions, but one of the things that's clarified in the Japanese text is that he is the frontier lord. Now this is actually a very obvious reference to because obviously Latria is not on the frontier, because like the implication is it's like in the southern area between like Boletaria and those southern kingdoms Ostrava is like visiting.
Yeah.
And then the frontier is presumably referring to what is referenced in a prologue in the Japanese website. I don't know if this got translated to the English website. Unfortunately, even using like Wayback Machine and stuff, it's really hard to verify the websites that got taken down and all the assets that got removed. Um, but the idea seems to have been that, as it's put, the Nexus was discovered in a hinterland of icy mountains at the limits of human inhabited land, and this is an obvious reference to the cut map, the northern limit, where it was going to be sort of the area where the giant archstone would have been. And Sandus K has done like a lot of work looking through that map and that, but the general gist seems to have been that with the story about like Rydell taking the Witch of the Sky's staff and stuff like that, which a lot of people have already inferred was related to the Maiden in Black, because you know the way like where the Nexus seems to be in the sky when we like jump down. It seems like Rydell may have been the person that actually discovered the Nexus over in the north, and he was like a lord on the frontier, and he was a big adventurer and all that, and he happened to find it. So we can actually blame Rydell for half of the plot happening then, if that's true. He's really the one at fault, but that seems to be the intention. And then now we see him in Latria there, and the fat, who are known as the fat officials in Boletaria, but in other areas they're known as fat ministers, and it's like fat ministers, like ministers of like legation, and these are looking into like the old usages for like for the term. It's something that usually has to refer to like people who like they're officials who work in like a diplomatic setting, usually under an ambassador or someone like that. So you can read this as like maybe Rydell was like an ambassador to Latria or something to that effect, and basically his little like underlings, like you know you have the ambassador and you have all your little officials working under you, like they kind of like locked him up in a prison, threw away the key, and kind of left him. Maybe sort of foreseeing what was about to happen with, you know, King Allant and the demons and, you know, all of this. So
yeah, or maybe they locked him up under the orders of Allant or something.
yeah, maybe, yeah, exactly. May even be going that far. Like that's something that for fans to theorize about. But yeah, so like a little details like that really help you kind of put together like a larger whole. And like the general like one of the general like misconceptions was like Valorfax was like somehow went back into the fog after he came out and told everyone that. But Ostrava says very plainly that Valorfax died with the legend. So it's more of like it's that trope of like, yeah, this giant fog like takes over the world, and like no one, like, well, not the world but Boletaria, and no one's like, okay, what's going on? And then suddenly like a hole bursts open, and like Valorfax comes like limping out, is like in his dying breath, is explaining everything that went on, and everyone's like, what the fuck, like what's going on? And everyone has to go inside to figure out. Like it's that kind of trope. It's like the village, like you come to the village, you see it burning, and then that one villager kind of hobbles out, like collapses in your arms to tell you before he dies what went wrong.
Yeah. And we know for a fact that Ostrava, this is a first-hand account of him saying it. He didn't hear that he died.
He just flat out says like Valorfax died with the legend, and then Bjor disappeared into the fog, or he says something to that effect. So yeah, like he's not even like, it's not even a case of, you know, that's what that's what I heard. Like he's pretty sure that's just how it is. And like I know there's people who theorize like stuff about, because like Bjor's art, the set that Bjor wears is also found like by the prisons or something to that effect. So people were speculating maybe that's Valorfax, but it's from what the Japanese text at least puts for Bjor, the armor set Bjor wears is just an armor he happened to find and put on during his time there. So it's not necessarily like stuff the Twin Fangs would have normally worn. It's something just like, it's related to the royal family, but it's not something
the
that
brushwood armor set. Yeah,
it's not something that is specific to Valorfax, and that's something that's worth keeping in mind, is that certain items, like, we associate them with certain characters because they wear them, but there's not like
Yeah.
necessarily them exclusively. Like, you'll see like tons of like tattered sets or things that are the description will have a specific context, and then you'll see them being used by like random NPCs. And the idea is usually like if it's a tattered set, like say like a pyromancer set or something like that. The idea may just be to say that, this is like someone dirty or someone like poor or someone like living sort of a destitute life, and it's divorced completely from the context of where you might find the item or where the item might normally, like for a certain character who might use it.
Yeah.
But like normally, like when you talk about say Astrea or certain items that are like unique and specific, those tend to be more relevant when we're talking about the original text, because say like the Ring of Sincere Prayer, the only thing that got really lost in translation with that was the first line, ironically, where it actually describes the ring. It's like it's supposed to say something to the effect of like a white silver ring with like a blue gem, and that sort of got translated out. I don't know why. Again, it's like sort of the Mercury Stone with the giving it to the prisoner. Sometimes there's just lines that like the localizers forgot to do.
Yeah.
And they kind of get skipped over. So that was like, you're like, okay, well, you know what? At least you got the picture for the ring, so you don't have to have that text. But it is useful because it's made a comparison in that it's basically the Ring of Devout Prayer. It's also a white silver ring. But obviously Astrea's is more sincere. It has a blue gem, which of course ties to her thematically because she's, has the blue blood sword and all that stuff. So like there's like a lot of like connections. In fact, working on my analysis for the Valley of Defilement is one of the densest in terms of like little translation stuff that are known, because it really helps you. Like when we're talking about the Dirty Colossus, it's like it's a very like basic boss, right? Like it's just like a giant like trash golem essentially. That
Yeah.
that throws flies at you. But like in terms of like, okay, why does this trash golem that throws flies at you, why does it give you like corrosion cloud, and like it has like the quote unquote corroded demon soul and things like that? Well, the idea is that corrosion, the Japanese word has two kanji in it, and the kanji is for something being eaten and something being rotten. And this is relevant because one, as when it's called a corroded demon soul, it's referring to it's something that's being eaten away at, and usually by insects. So the idea is that all the flies are kind of coming around the demon boss because they want to like feast on its body.
Mm.
And the general idea of corrosion being eaten and rotted is because, well, one, we have all the idea of the flies, and then the other is that rot. And the Valley of Defilement's original name is the Rotten Valley, which you kind of see when you look at Dark Souls games, where like you see the Rotten, of course, in Dark Souls 2 and stuff like that. Like this idea of rot is a theme that comes with like all the swamp maps.
Yeah. And that's I assume that's also true of the leechmonger, where it's just these leeches are feeding off the soul.
Yeah, so
rather than the soul having assembled the leeches.
Well, the thing is that in Demon Souls is that it's a little different from Dark Souls in that Dark Souls, like, the soul is, like, the source of life itself, so it's sort of the centerpiece, like, everything has to revolve around the soul. In Demon Souls, the soul is, I guess, technically optional in that it's the source of thought. It's source of consciousness, awareness. I think the localization mostly puts it as, like, comprehension or something to that effect. And the idea, the idea being is that, like, it's your mind, so to speak, right? It's your mind essentially, and that you can be a living thing without a soul. You're just mindless. You have no reason. You have no thought process. Like you have no awareness of your surroundings. Really, you're just a soul-starved monster, like brainless. Which is a little different than say how the Hollows work under the hood, like visually or superficially. They essentially act the same, like two mindless monsters. But in Demon Souls, you kind of have this entire thing where, like, you can have, like, sentient creatures, and then you can have, like, creatures, at least, that are alive, and they're technically alive, at least biologically speaking, but then, if they don't have souls, there's nothing, there. Like, what makes you is gone, essentially. And with the Leechmonger, it's sort of like this, a leech pile. It's like a leech collection pooled together, and it's like, that's what it is, and they have this, and apparently, because, like, it's the same thing with the flies. There's like an art book that mentions the flies being like demons, so it's like I guess like all the bugs turn to demonhood. So the leeches are apparently the leechmonger is apparently among them, and that all the leeches sort of are like this demonic sort of hive mind working together. And then the the what's the word? The term leechmonger is more like a leech pile or a leech like a leech pool, so to speak. In that, because
Yeah.
that's what it is. It's just a pile of leeches, and the actual kanji for it is used again in the description for poison cloud when it's talking about how um like it's supposed the idea of poison cloud is supposed to represent all the filth in the valley, right? And the idea is like all the filth that's accumulated, that's piled up in the valley is represented by this spell. And that's what the leechmonger is also supposed to do. It's a leech pile. Sort of all the filth falls down here and all the leeches have sort of piled on into like over onto the filth. And then that continues with the Dirty Colossus and the Corroded Demon Soul, and then it reaches its zenith when we get to Astrea, who is supposed to be the dirtiest of them all, and she has, well, Death Cloud. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I also want to talk a bit about Astrea because in the English version, it's very blatant that she's a good person. In the Japanese, I get that she's also a good person, but it's a bit more twisted. Where
Yeah, I go over this in my analysis for Demon Souls, where Astrea,
where
like Astrea, like there's clearly like two like modes of Astrea. There's like her intentions, which are she has totally good intentions, and there is sort of the outcomes and the actions that she's actually doing, which are kind of screwed up.
where her methodology for ailing the suffering in the valley is to just take away people's souls so they don't have the consciousness to be aware of it.
Well, that's the idea, is that our ability to think, to have awareness, to have any sort of consciousness allows us to feel pain. So it's like we can have all the good things, we can also have bad things. And Astrea sees the suffering of the valley, and she's like, well, how could God allow all this suffering and awful? Like I know better. So I know like I'm this like I'm as close to God in sort of essence as anyone. Like she's sort of this pure-hearted person, and she feels so bad for all these people who are suffering. She knows how she can fix this. Let's just take away the thoughts that bring pain. Like just get rid of it. Just nip it in the bud. And so she's essentially having all of her followers, who are these people who have suffered and they've just been awaiting death basically, because like they've had a life of endless suffering. And this is where the sympathetic element really comes in, because she really sees this, and you can understand how she's totally aghast at this. But when you look at what she's actually doing, she's essentially having all of her like zealous followers go around. All the women and children in the valley have basically been killed, except for like the filthy woman and her invisible child, because Miyazaki wasn't allowed to kill children.
Oh, is that why the kid isn't there?
That's my assumption, because it seems like whenever there's a case where children would be brutally killed, or could be, like anytime that like the player or an NPC could have brutally killed a child, like it always seems to somehow the child turns like invisible and disappears from being able to be visibly doing that. So I assume that's the reason why, because that seems to be a trend in most of the games. I mean, I think we just have to ask Ocelot. But so
is that also the guy that merchant in Dark Souls who I believe you kill him to get the Uchigatana?
Satsuki,
yeah, he's also talking about somebody.
As in,
there's a merchant in Dark Souls 1 where not
Satsuki. Sorry, the one in Dark Souls 1. The what's his name? Shiva. Yeah.
Yeah, well he's like not Shiva. I believe it's the guy who sells you
the undead merchant, right? The one who replaces Dregling, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. He's also like seemingly stroking a cat or something.
Oh yeah. That's I assume that's Yuria or Yulia, sorry, as it's put in English. Yeah. So like, because like I think there were some people who like speculate it might be the katana itself, but like just the way he's like behaving, like he acts like, and there's a like in the line in the Japanese, it's very clear he's like a sickum type of thing he's saying. So it looks like he's like got a cat or a dog, and he's just like, poor guy, he's lost so many souls, and he's like becoming so hollow that he he can no longer realize that like his pet, maybe if it ever existed, is not there.
So but going back to going back to Astrea, that's one of the translations which sort of irks me, that sort of more devious aspect was removed, because that ties right back into the end of the game where you can save the world, but to what end?
Well, yeah, well, that's the point of, like, Death Cloud in Dark. Like, the idea in Death Cloud in English is it talks about it being like a plague, and I think plague status is how they express it, because they didn't have toxic like they do in Dark Souls, right? So, but in the Japanese, it's very clear that it says it's literally a cloud of death. Like, it's death made manifest. And that's kind of the point, is that Astrea has all these good intentions. She wants to help and do so. But, like, at the end of the day, like, her desire to help and embrace these people and try to do what she thinks is best ends up creating death.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, all the women and, like, the women and children, because, like, it's very explicit in the script that, like, the people who are following Astrea, they're men. Like, these are all, like, men who are very much taken with her, either visually, and of course the idea that she's compassionate. Miyazaki loves his, like, motherly figures, characters that he can sort of put into his narratives. But this idea of this woman who, like, she's this beautiful young virgin woman who is showing all this compassion and showing them, like, all this, like, love and relief that they've never had before, and they sort of become these zealous followers that are sort of killing anyone and everything in the valley that come to the valley or in the valley. And the filthy woman is very explicit in the Japanese. Her concern isn't, like, obviously there's the vain aspect where she's like, I was loved before. But, like, the first thing she tells you when she's first talking about Astrea is that, like, if they look at me, we're going to be, like, me and my child are going to be attacked. Like, she doesn't want, like, her concern is, like, if they spot her, like, she's dead. And you even see, like, a corpse of, like, of the filthy woman's model, like, lying on the floor in some areas and stuff. So, like, it's very clear that, like, women and children are the ones being victimized because of Astrea's little cult. And anyone else that comes in, like all the church people that come in, they're, I guess I should say temple people, but all of them that are coming in, they're also, of course, being attacked. And all of it is so they can offer souls to Astrea, who's ultimately, she's complicit in the old ones wiping out of humanity. Like, we have to keep that in mind. Like, she's ultimately a demon who's part of this system of, they collect demons, they give it to the old one, and then the process repeats itself. So, like, she's already kind of putting herself in a dicey situation. It's like, oh, what have we done? It's like, well, lady, you're kind of a necessary roadblock to, like, the salvation of the human race. Like, it's kind of have to decide. And then, but then, like, add to that, it's instead of it being, as the English puts it, like, she just wants to, like, save them from their pain. It's like she wants to, like, help take away their thoughts that bring pain. And so when they're offering up their souls and they're like, oh, lady, like, here you go, like, their goddess. And then she's like, okay, thank you. I take these souls and I'll take yours with you as a reward. And it's like, congrats. You now can no longer feel any pain. You also can't feel happiness. You can't possibly ever be uplifted out of your situation. You're basically just a mindless husk. You're essentially been lobotomized. But, like, neither here nor there. It's for the best.
I wonder, with the Valley of Defilement, I wondered in my video whether that could at one point have been Mura, the sort of lost land of the church, but going over the translations, it seems like it because in the English I felt like there were so many nods to that, but in the translation it seems more that the reason there are so many church apparels here is because the church just sends agents.
Yeah, it's been just sending holy knights, like, en masse. And that seems to be the general idea, is that the temple has, like, the temple of God. Because, like, there is no mention of a church in the Japanese script. There's just the priesthood. And we're told about Murd being the place of, like, the first temples. So, like, the idea seems to be that, like, the temple of God, as I call it, is sort of this... They send, like, they hear all these rumors about Astrea leaking out of the fog. I guess someone's leaving the fog to, like, spread these rumors. And, like, they hear they're like, like, is this true? Like, we don't know. So they send people in to do it, and all these people turn up dead. So I'm like, at some point you gotta think there'd be sunk cost, but I guess they got temple soldiers up the wazoo, because there's, like, dozens of them that you find around there. So yeah, my take was that more, like, from what it looks like is that the valley was just a natural, like, it was sort of like this confluence of, like, people are dumping their shit. And then that stuff naturally, because this is something you'll notice in a lot of Miyazaki games, is this idea of, like, there's a flow, like especially with water, there's like this flowing stream, like sort of visual that you have, where like all these things are kind of flowing down the water, all this trash and stuff, and eventually, of course, it inevitably sinks downward. To go to the lowest point because of gravity and all that, and then all these things flow into this valley, and at the bottom of the valley, it creates this sort of toxic swamp where all these diseases and insects and pests and all these things sort of happen because again it stagnates at the bottom because eventually when you have this like, kind of flowing water that's cleansing impurities, eventually you have to wonder, okay, when does the flow stop? And what happens at the end of that flow? And for Miyazaki's answer is that, well, eventually it stagnates and it ends up becoming this arguably even more corrupt and impure place. And like you can see that for sure, like definitely in Dark Souls 3, but in Dark Souls 1, when he takes that idea of like sort of you going lower and sort of things get more like filthy and like unsightly. And it's a very fascinating idea because you brought up the idea of like Murd being the temple, but it seems more like it's a natural sort of dumping ground to have, and like these people who are described as like the wandering poor were essentially, they were seemingly forced to live there because they had nowhere else to go. Like no one else was taking them in. That's why presumably they're wandering, because no one else will let them settle. It's like all these poor people with their disease and their sickliness and their poor wages, and it's like we gotta like we don't want you. Like we don't want you adding to our poverty. So they ended up having to settle in this one place that no one cared about them living, which is of course the trash dump.
Yeah.
And they've ended up been living for centuries ever since, like in suffering. And like yeah, so stuff like that is definitely unfortunate. But you bring up like stuff like clarity. For me, I think some of the stuff that you can infer, yes, it's not that big of an issue, but some stuff it just is useful because some people will speculate or talk around certain points because they're like, well, it kind of looks like this, but what if we take it this direction? And sometimes being direct is just, in my opinion, just the best way for people to understand it. Because when you know like the clear, precise language, then okay, this is the pole of which to work around. Like for example, going back to Latria, there's the giant ball of like flesh that has the generous like centipede demon monsters coming out at the end. And
yes.
Yeah, and
I thought you meant the guys who are those balls that shoot magic at you.
No, not those. The actual like giant flesh ball that you like knock down, like, you kind of like knock down, and it like comes out all the centipedes. The actual like original script makes it clear that when we're talking about the like suspended cages and all of that area, the second area, is the ivory tower. So like for people who are like wondering like, do we ever see the ivory tower, where is it, like doing so, no, that's the ivory tower that we're supposed to be at. And the hanging cages and all that are supposed to be used in that they would take all the everyone who's sort of suspended in these cages and kind of like drop them into this flesh ball. And actually, if you look in the game files, that ball is considered an enemy. And is referred to as the ball of chimera, a chimera ball. For reference, the prisoner ball that you see in like the first area of the prison, that's also called Ball of Prisoner. So like you can kind of see the foreshadowing there. But the general idea is that it's very clear from, like, how does it put it? Yeah, in the English for the Archstone of the Man-Eater, it's masses of flesh litter these hanging prisons. And then, like, it just says, unrelatedly, Latria's current master, an old man who's older, has been creating his own demons. It's like, oh, okay. So, like, I guess they're making him out of the flesh? But it's very clear here. It says, a ball of meat melding together humans hanging in the cage cells was made at the former ivory tower. So the idea is very clear, is that this ball is what is creating all the demons, and that the old man has just been having all the prisoners meld together. All these humans are being thrown into kind of the mix, the melting pot, and creating this giant, like, obviously very berserk inspired sort of massive human flesh with faces and all that thing.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry.
No, just as a side note, the actual centipedes that come out in the game files, they're referred to as the pest, basically socialites. Like they're people of high society, like the rich who like go to all the like party it out and all that. So the idea is that, yeah, those are all supposed to be the nobles of Latria who've all been thrown in, who became prisoners and were all thrown in and made into those demonic abominations.
Oh.
Yeah.
And all right, so going again, another instance of you can just beat the Recht, and that sort of eliminates all ambiguity. The legendary Big M probably isn't the Flame Lurker, and probably isn't the ancestor of Adam Baldwin.
Well, at least the second part, he's probably not the ancestor. I don't know about the Flame Lurker part. It's again, it's so you pointed out your own thing from a narrative perspective. It doesn't really make much sense otherwise, but it's it's definitely very vague no matter what.
Yeah.
But this part about him being like the ancestor, probably not. He's probably just a famous figure in like the lore of the local lore, and like they. And
Yeah.
you know, like, well, the idea is that like if you're a strong man, you like worship like Big M basically, and like that's why it's
Yeah.
called like Hands of God or the God Hand, and it's like,
And that's why they have them. It's
Yeah,
not; these aren't heirlooms, because that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
For you get the heirlooms from them and from the legendary Big M's corpse. It's just that they hear his story, and then they themselves have these hands.
yeah, and that's the idea is like, yeah, like it's very made clear in Stonefang. The idea is that like Stonefang is filled of tough men, and like, you know, like they're the manly men, and they'll like have bare knuckle brawls because, you know, that's how men sort things out and all that. So like it's clear that they're that type of culture, and like that seems to derive in part because of, well, Big M. It's clarified like the dragon's Big M apparently like spent his days beating up for fun apparently. Were like it's described as like dragon servants. So like I guess like he enslaved all the dragons, and he's like, you know what, you're gonna spend the rest of your life entertaining me. And then they all got killed. Oh my goodness. So like, yeah, so like,
Yeah. And the reason Ed wants his soul, it's not that his soul has any connection to him ancestry wise, or because there's some blacksmithing ancestry in that soul. No, it's just that that's a good soul. Like that soul is an inferno of wrath.
Yeah, like
he
he wants like you know, it's like it's a big fiery soul that they can use for blacksmithing. You see that you can see that in like subsequent games too. This idea of like using like kind of like magic fire in order to help like imbue certain qualities into it. For them, they use it for soul weapons, if I remember correct, right? Like when you're forging.
Yes,
like,
yes.
So.
And you also noted in your translations that ore has some soul quality to it too.
Yeah, like
which
he's very clear because he uses a term that basically means like spirits, or like you could translate it, I suppose, as soul in some way, but it refers to like spirits or something to that. Like he calls it sprites, I think, in the English version. Which again, I don't know if that was a typo and no one caught it. But like it is what it is. So like we ended up, the idea being is that it's like they called it like transmorgified, but the idea is that it's a different form of spirits. So like these are like souls are in like the dragon bones, and like some of that like turns into like between the lava and stuff, it ends up becoming its own ore, quote unquote. And the same is true for like basically all the ore that we find, is that there's some level of like souls in the mix.
Yes.
And as we know, like the way Miyazaki handles souls in Souls games is that it's like souls have like their own qualities, and like they can kind of take on like unique natures and things like that. And as a result, you could kind of end up with like different expressions or forms of souls when you mix them with other qualities and things. And that's how we get like soul weapons and stuff like that, because they are supposed to reflect the essence of the person in some way. And even like the vendors in Demon Souls are very interesting, because they, like, each vendor obviously has their own like agenda. They have their own mindset and their worldview. Like Urbane is very different from Freck, who's very different from Yuria. And like the result is that the souls that they take and what they can produce from those souls ends up being very different as well, because they have very different they have different starting points on how they work with it, so to speak.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, like Urbane is always going to make it somehow relate to God.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, that's actually a very good point. So you actually mentioned this in your video, but it's worth kind of reiterating, is that Freck was a priest. Like he was once a high-ranking priest, and some of that kind of
I caught that in like my game manual. Like that was an offhand remark made there. I couldn't find it anywhere else in the game.
Well, it's in the Japanese website profiles, and I think the English ones as well. But it's also in game. the actual outfit that Freck wears, and this is I assume this was a typo. I can't imagine this was intentional. Is that they wrote as like, oh, like Freck has these clothes, but they're just the dirty clothes of a sage. And it's like, well, yeah, because he is a sage, so like, what's the point of pointing this out? But no, what I think they were supposed to put was the dirty clothes of a saint. Because actually, this is worth pointing out. So when you hear something like Saint Astrea or Saint Urbane or Saint Aldrich or like any of like the saints in like the Souls games, it's not like a Christian saint type of deal. It's not like, like, oh, this person is especially holy, let's denominate them as a saint. No, what it's saying is that you're a holy man or you're a holy woman. So in the case of like Aldrich or Urbane, it's just saying, you're a holy man, you're a clergyman, basically. Like, that's all it's really saying. And when it comes to Astrea, in the context of Demon Souls, she's referred to as a holy woman. And apparently that's a little more special in Demon Souls, because, like, she's the sixth holy woman. So, like, she's apparently they don't have many women who they consider particularly holy. And, like, there's, like, only 6 of them, apparently, in the history of the temple, or maybe at once, like, So, like, that's something that's worth keeping in mind. So, like, it's not like when it says, like, oh, 6 Saint Astrea, it's including both men and women. No, it's specifically saying 6 holy woman. And like Urbane and Freck are both supposed to be holy men. They're both saints, quote unquote. And the idea is that they were both high-ranking priests. Well, Freck was. Urbane still is.
Yeah.
And that's like something that's doing so. So I'm glad you caught that, because like a lot of stuff from website profiles, and like I said, there was the prologue that I can only find on the Japanese website, that really kind of help with the framing for the lore. Like Ed's last name is Weiss is only in the website profiles, if I remember correctly, and that's an Armored Core reference. So like that's something that's that's something that's like minor, but you're like, oh, good to know he has a surname. I guess it's Baldwin's surname too, unless like
unless he took his wife's name, or
yeah, took his wife's name or something. But like, yeah, so stuff like that, and like there's just so many like little things like that like go into it. Like for example, when we're talking about like the liar in Latria, the one who's like, ye fools, like you don't know about how she resurrects and all that. Like when he clarifies that he's just, I'm a humble servant, it's specifically referring to like a maid servant, like someone who like cleans the bedrooms and all that. So like after the big orgies that the nobility all go through, like he's like the guy's like, I gotta clean up now. So like you can kind of see like this is someone who might be a little resentful about all these rich people that he's been working under for a long time, and now he gets to kind of have his revenge like the old monk. So
yeah, and he's just sort of a character in the English version. He comes across as sort of sinister to you. Whereas in the Japanese version, it's just more an attitude he's developed over his life.
Yeah, it's very clear when you like see it. You're like, okay, so he's specifically this kind of servant. Okay, so you get like it's not like he's a servant of the old monk. It's that he's so like he's basically like we basically see this guy who has this like this big bravado, but then when the danger comes to it, he's like, oh, I'm just the poor like maid servant. I just I was just cleaning and all that. Like I'm really not involved. You don't have to pay attention to me. Like now he doesn't want the attention anymore. Before it was like, oh, I have this giant idol who I'm able to keep resurrecting endlessly for my new lord, the old monk, and it's like he feels all confident. And then, like, small stuff like that. Like I said, I pointed out the stuff with the Mercury Stone. I pointed out the stuff with the Nobles. So, like, when you're talking about, like, the Royal class that you can pick, it's really a Noble class. And it's the same thing with, like, with Astrea. It's, like, the same, like, kanji being used. When we're talking about, like, Astrea and, like, she's true nobility. Is the idea is, like, she's not just, perhaps, a actual blue blood. She's someone who is, at her core, she is truly a noble soul, so to speak.
Yes.
And the same idea is that we have this idea of like the nobility in Latria especially are sort of these people who not only are like impressive magicians and stuff, because probably they're the only one that can afford to spend the time researching it. They're also what's the word? Total like debaucherous people who like they spend all their money and they're wasteful, and like they were not exactly like one of the things that we can appreciate with Demon Souls' writing is that like as you point out, like everyone is sort of comes out with a little bit of dirt on them. No one is like completely clean. And even so like so to speak, the Yormadar family, one interesting little detail that is only in the website profiles, and I assume in your booklet too, is that it actually mentioned that Freck is associated with the Jormungandrs. Like, he's referred to as like a Jormungandr sage, and it's not clear if like that means he's from the family or that he's sort of like sponsored by them. But Freck is credited with basically being the person that made it so like he basically made it so like you could learn, like any person could learn the soul arts. Like, he gave it an academic framework that you could understand and reason, because the idea seems to be that like I talk about like Rydell, maybe he's the one that found the nexus, but basically Allant, King Allant, like discovers the nexus and the soul arts, and like Boletaria starts like prospering because of it, and it looks like Latria and Freck end up kind of try to catch up. So like one detail that got lost was that the Latria archstone mentions that actually the Latria is not just the country of the Ivory Tower, it's the country of the Ivory Tower the Queen restored. So the idea was that presumably, after, Monumental banned the soul arts, there was no the Ivory Tower and like its academic learning of presumably the soul arts was completely closed down apparently, and kind of just like forgotten about for years. And then presumably once the soul arts were rediscovered, and it's like, oh god, our giant superpower neighbor is learning all these really powerful stuff that gives them a huge military advantage. Maybe we should like start things back up and compete. And so suddenly the Ivory Tower gets restored by the Queen, and like everyone's now relearning soul arts, and Freck seems to have discovered a way to systemize everything. So that way now we see like in like the standard country outside of Boletaria and the general region is like there's like town magicians and stuff that are now existing and things like that. And like even like we see, as we can pick the noble class. Even nobles from like foreign countries are apparently able to learn magic now. So it's like Freck also contributed to the current problem.
Yeah, and that also gives us a little light as to why he is in Latria, why we find him there.
Yeah,
it's not that he went to Latria to fight the monk, it's that he was in Latria and imprisoned by the monk.
Well, we know that he went into the fog, but it seems like the reason why he went to Latria first was because, yes, it seems like he either is from Latria originally, or that's where he went when he decided he was no longer going to be a priest. Like I mentioned earlier, the idea being is that the idea of him having his clothes dirtied, and I've talked about the idea of corruption in my analysis of Valley of Defilement, this idea of the church, of the temple, being sort of, there's this idea that you have to be pure in the temple, and some of it is very rooted in very Japanese Shintoism and things like that, but the notion that like you have to be like totally devoted to God without ever being corrupted. And the idea is that just like how Freck's clothes were once like Urbane's clothes, they were once like, oh, that's why they're basically the same model, but like one's black, one's white, is that the idea is that sort of like the Anastasia scenario where like the idea being is that you have this holy man's clothes who were dirtied, just like how Freck's faith has been dirtied, and he's no longer a holy man. He's now just a wise man, a sage who is studying the souls, and obviously he's no longer a man of God. And with Freck in particular, it seems like he either came from Latria and he was a priest there, or he like ended up going to Latria to study the soul arts and things like that. And as a result, he sort of become this sage associated with the distinguished Jormungandr family. And after everything with the fog happened, he seems to have gone inside, went to Latria, got himself locked up, and left his apprentice to be like, "Can someone please save my master? He's a genius." And Frank even mentions he's been there for a long time, so like
yeah, that's another part which is sort of lost in the English translation, is that, and I made a note of this in my video. It's really difficult to get a timeline of events,
well,
because it seems like because the way it's translated, it seems like Ostrava was in Latria for some time and then came to Boletaria, but like the timeline just, it doesn't quite add up.
Right. So
unless Ostrava went with Rydell, where Rydell went into an excavation and then came back. or something like that.
Well, one of the problems that happens with Ostrava's lore specifically is that like they translate the where he went wrong, in that they describe it as like he went to like the southern, he went to like the southern, and people like it's like, so people end up thinking like Latria and all these other countries we go to are like somehow client states, or like Boletaria is actually much bigger than we realize, and like it's all part of like this big like super empire with all these kingdoms inside of it. It's like, no, Boletaria is its own like United Nations superpower. Where Ostrava went was this. He just went to all these kingdoms that are in the south, and they're all, apparently they're more technologically advanced relative to the rest of the setting. And Latria seems to, because we find like various items from these southern kingdoms also there, seems to be sitting somewhere between these southern kingdoms, so it's probably somewhere in the south, and Boletaria, which is obviously also has to be because, you know, it's in the fog. But so that seems to be one thing that got lost in the translation. So you have like Ostrava, who's apparently was just like touring the, like, I guess it was like a prince touring the rest of the world. Like, you know, he's just like on his little, like, for years he's been just spending his time vacationing in like the south outside of his country. But
Ostrava World Tour.
Ostrava World Tour. But like once the fog comes in, he apparently only recently went into the fog. I assume presumably because like Bjorn and people went in, so he's like, oh, they'll handle it, and like I'll just wait here and stay safe.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's made clear from like website profiles and different dialogue options that's like Bjorn went in many years ago. So we're talking like maybe 5, like maybe like if we want to like really push it, like maybe 10-ish. Like we don't know how long exactly it's been since the fog first showed up, but we're thinking like 5-ish. Like Astrea shows up in the valley several years ago, so like we're talking like 2, 3-ish. Right? So, like, that seems to be the idea, is that, like, everyone shows up, like, about, like, 5 or so years ago, like, things like the fog shows up and people start flooding in. Astrea, like, a few years later, ends up in the Valley of Defilement, and we know the rest from there. And then, like, the actual timeline of, like, the first Scourge, I think it's, my take is that it's about, like, a few hundred years ago. We're talking about, like, 300, roughly. Because, like, we have references, like, the Japanese for the Shrine of Storms, Shrine of Storms, Archstone is very clear that the Shadow Men and their religion died out several hundred years ago, specifically. So I think the English puts it as like hundreds of years ago or something like that, but it's a little more specific in that it's several hundred years ago. So we're talking about like, okay, so a few hundred years ago, their faith just suddenly died out. Now again, they're using like all these like dubious spells and like soul arts and all that. So again, when like the Monumentals are like, no, we're banning that. Obviously, all these like faiths and religions and ivory towers and like entire like faiths revolving around soul arts have to kind of like stop.
Yeah, that's also another point worth noting. The Japanese does not mention the Monumentals being benevolent.
Yeah, no, yeah, like like one thing you'll notice with the English is that they have this tendency to want to take some liberties and just like add words.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, our benevolent reign, which, you know, kind of sounds a little arrogant. And that may have been what they were trying to come across with the character. But like, yeah, it's the actual like text. There's nothing like, there's none of those little add-ins or anything like that. It's just like, you know, they were once the Boletaria. They were once the superpower that basically ruled the world essentially. And then they got arrogant enough to awaken the old one, and things went wrong from there. So like, yeah, stuff like that. But like going with like you said with Latria, is like timeline wise, there's also the notion that like King Allant the 12th is what we're told at the beginning with the prologue. The original text is a little more nuanced in that it's not written the same way as where you usually would write, like you wouldn't write, like the way that it's written in Japanese is the way you'd say like King Louis the 14th or something like that, right? Like there's a different there's its own format in Japanese for how you would write someone's like number title with their name or something. And also, we know that Allant is a surname, so it doesn't really make much sense in that respect to call someone Allant the 12th, because it's like, you know, you don't call Henry VIII Tudor the Second or whatever, like, right?
No,
so,
because it's also like, it's a surname.
Yeah, it's
Ariona
Allant, right?
example.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Like Rydell is called Little Allant, so presumably he's like his brother or something, right? So
Yeah.
Like, seems the idea. It actually says he's the 12th generation Allant, so it seems like it's more like it's a dynasty, and this is the 12th King Allant in the dynasty. And obviously, you go back like 20, give like like average every generation about 25 years. You go back about 300 years, and that's another reason why I think like a 300-year time frame for the first Scourge may be more relevant. Is that it seems like, you have all these like sort of world-shaking apocalyptic events, and then you have like sort of this new dynasty of Boletaria, and it's even stated in the Japanese with Boletaria. What do they call it? Like the king of a diligent land, I think they say in English, for like when it talks
like
about the
a
Archstone.
small but diligent land.
Yeah, small but diligent land. Well, it's very clear the idea is like it's the ambitious king of a small country. So the idea is that you have this king of a very small country, but clearly he wants his small country to be something more. And flash forward 12 generations, like potentially 12 generations later, and you have the current King Allant riding over a superpower that is Boletaria. It's now this giant like country now. So like you can kind of see how like the foreshadowing is sort of set up there. In the Japanese. Again, I don't know why diligent was chosen as a word. What's another? Oh yeah, Shrine of Storms. One thing you pointed out in your video was you were talking about like the water and stuff when you were trying to go through the process of how everyone in like how like the Shrine of Storms like burial process worked. And one thing that the archstones for the Japanese text make very clear is that the idea is that you go through like the judgment by the judge, and then you get carried on and you get basically embalmed with light water, like you're bathed in this water. Like that's the point of that entire room, is that like they would like bathe you in this light water in preparation for the burial. And it's probably also why like the old hero boss is like glowing like that.
Mm-hmm.
So like stuff like that, like that's probably the intention they're doing. And like little things like that are told to you directly and give you so much more context for what's going on or what's being told. Now, I don't know if it's because like they had like space, because from what I've seen in game, the text for like archstones are pretty big. So like I'm not sure if like they didn't have enough room to like translate it full. So they're like, okay, well let's kind of like give you the Spark Notes version as best we can.
Yeah, probably. Kanji has always had an advantage going back to like old RPGs, in that you can just tell so much more with so much less space.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if that's a technological limitation they actually had, but like it's probably the best defense you have for some of this.
No, but there are Archstone descriptions that you have to scroll down from memory.
Yeah, I don't know what like the word cap or anything could be. So again, I'm just throwing out a possibility there. But yeah,
throwing them a bone.
Yeah, like just give them a bone for those people, like stuff like that. Like there's also like, what is it, like the dragon god is called the Sultan of Chaos. It's when they're saying Sultan, they mean tyrant, and that, which again I think is very evident as to why. Like it's like, big dragon, overwhelming power. Yeah, kind of punches you out if you beat the first boss because you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so stuff like that. So that covers that. Oh, Vinland. That's another big one. Was the Vinlands.
Oh, yeah, the Vinland family.
Yeah.
The description on the helmet, speaking of two families, that really stumped me. So I basically omitted that conversation. There aren't two families.
No, there aren't. It's supposed to be Doke, which means the same family. So I don't know how. I don't know how they went from that. Like I don't know how you could have possibly like even glanced at that and decided the two like oh god, I'm not gonna say it. But the idea is like the Vinland thing is very vague for a lot of the text, so I can understand it. But once you read that part of the helmet, it's very clear that it's referring to like when it's talking about like, is it in Vinland or to Vinland or to Vinlands? It's clear. Okay, it's to the Vinlands. Like that's the idea, is that Vinland isn't a place; it's a family, and they are a family that just happens to apparently be close to God because they have some holy tree there. Yeah. And that's actually something worth pointing out, is that like they refer to it as a spirit tree, and you see this term also thrown around in Dark Souls. It basically refers to a tree that is somehow close to God. Either it's blessed by God, like God uses it as a vessel for his spirit or his or her spirit, or like it's worshipped as a god, like in Dark Souls 3. So like yeah, like that's sort of the idea when you see stuff like spirit tree. So like in the setting of Demon Souls, you have to wonder like, okay, so like, is this supposed to be like a tree blessed by God? Because that seems to be generally the idea, is a lot of items related to magic end up basically being labeled, like these items, they're labeled as like divine revelations, and like it's like doing so, and like that's what happened with like Astrea. Like apparently she found a a ring, and that's presumably why she's been raised up as like, oh, the sixth saint, this is a revelation from God. When
That's
really,
also where we get the Spear of Israel and the Moonlight Blade.
yeah, they're also
The large
called
sword
like
of
revelation.
moonlight.
Presumably, like a similar process happened. Like these are items that predate the temple, probably, but like they were discovered, and they're considered like God sort of led people to find them, and they became these items that were considered to be holy. And like you see with the case of well, with the temple especially, you like the idea with Astrea is that like it's all like given to like divine providence and things like that. Like the will of God led her to do so. But the implication of Blue Blood Sword is that she just had a lot of luck. She was just a very lucky
Yeah.
girl. And that and you talk about this in like the general format, but for like Astrea specifically, the idea seems to be that um a lot of her life has just been she was luck. She was born into a privileged family. She was born to be like fighting this idea that made her a holy woman. So she was always protected and living this like cloistered life as a woman of the temple. And
She was very beautiful.
yeah, it
She
was
was
beautiful.
very
And like
yeah.
yeah, and luck happens to also govern resistance to disease. So she's probably never been sick in her life too. So she's probably never known any type of suffering. um
Yeah.
so like there's this idea that idea is very much carried over. And then of course you imagine like you have this rich woman who's like never like she's never lived she's lived in luxury her entire life, and then she sees like the valley, and it's like this stark contrast, like suddenly like the culture shock, like you can kind of see how like it broke her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the talking about all of that, there's the notion like you brought this up with like patches and urbane and things like that. But like it's very clear that the temple is not the most what's the word? Uh not the most upstanding place in all of its
No.
areas. Like they may be devout, but they're not necessarily they're not necessarily pure in every sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um
That's sort of the general theme of Demon Souls. Evil predates the demons.
Yeah, yeah. And there's this, like I said, this idea of malice is brought up very
Yes.
clearly in the script. And there's the like with the with Latria, like it's very said. It's like like be prepared. You're gonna look at some ugly malice when it comes to like Latria when you go beyond the church, because the idea being is that like the church is sort of like this ruse, like it's sort of like this shiny coat of paint that's hiding what's beyond it, which is of course them like being all the prisoners are carried by the gargoyles, and then they're locked up, and then they're added to like this giant meatball, which is creating more demons. And then you have like the valley, which is this place which you talk about as being sort of like a natural evil. And like the idea with I touched on it earlier, is this idea of kegare, this idea of corruption or like defilement, or there's a lot of ways you can put it, but it's basically it means to be like dirty, but in the context of Shinto it has this idea that you are basically ritually impure. And you need to, it's not necessarily that it's not like something like you've sinned and now like you're like like it's not like an original sin concept type of idea, understand? It's something like you are like if you touch a corpse, if you eat certain foods, if you do like certain actions or things, and some of these you could kind of see a sociological reason, a background for why these exist, but the idea is basically this filth spreads to you. Now if you are a good person, you're going to have yourself purified, because that impurity, if you willingly or carelessly spread it to the rest of the community, like that's a no bueno. But the general idea that you are someone who should cleanse yourself, and this is something that you can see this a lot in Japanese. This idea of cleansing is very important. Now, obviously, Miyazaki, as I said, takes it to the logical conclusion of, okay, what's at the end of the cleansing? What happens when that flowing water that sort of cleanse you of your impurities finally reaches its end point? And we see that is that all that corruption sort of piles up and sort of propagates and arguably gets worse. And then the idea of kegare is carried over with the temple, and that there's this idea that you have to be someone who's devoted, you're a devoted member of the priesthood without ever being corrupted. And that's presumably the same life that Astrea had lived. And that's something that Freck couldn't live. He ended up getting dirty. His faith ended up being corrupted because he could not live with the knowledge that he's kind of studied and uncovered and learned and still be a man of the temple.
And that's
then,
also with Allant, that sort of general, the more you learn, the more he sort of becomes disgusted by that moral puritanism. There's a cut line from the game where he speaks, where he says, I've had enough of this rotten world.
Yeah. There's that line in the Japanese script where he basically is just said like, he's just done with it. And one of the things that's said very
Yeah.
directly is like, I think in the English it's something like fight poison with poison, but it's very clear
Yes.
that what Allant's saying is that God gave us the poison called the beast, the old one basically,
Yeah.
and the old one is this ancient beast that has been left on the world, exists basically to be like the divine trash dump. Like God's like first day God's like, okay, I create all the world, I give them all souls so they can think and thought and reason. What could possibly go wrong? Then day 2, I made mistakes.
Yeah.
It's like some people make some very bad choices, and the idea is that like we mentioned earlier with the regalia is like because of malice, stuff like the northern regalia was left behind. Is the idea is that
Yeah.
God gave people free will. He gave them consciousness. They gave them the ability to reason and make their own decisions and come to their own conclusions. And people would abuse that reason for the wrong. And so like it's like, okay, I'm just gonna leave this giant demon that's going to literally suck up all of your souls if you can't all play nice. And then he was like, okay, my work is done. Yeah. Oh my god.
I feel like also I got a few comments that said that it's actually not that it is a good ending to put the old one back to sleep. I just want to reiterate that I don't think it is a good ending. Well, whether or not it's a good ending, I don't think the game asserts that it's a good ending.
Well, I think it's sort of that ending where it's like, well, did you solve the underlying problem? Which is,
Yeah.
which is the thing even in Dark Souls too, is this this underlying idea is that the human condition is what it is.
Yeah.
So it has this. We humans have this unique ability to have a propensity for sin, and
Yes.
sort of like sort of this idea is like no matter what institution, like it doesn't matter how perfect the institution you create, humans are running it, so it'll inevitably tend toward corruption, right? So this idea
Yeah.
that you can't have like just imperfect as we are, like the events of Demon Souls will probably happen again. It happened twice now. Like who's to say it'll happen a third time? So I can understand your perspective that it's a bad end. It's not a happy ending, so to speak. It's definitely not the most uplifting ending when you think of the implications. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Then and like I think that covers like a lot of like some of the basics and stuff. Like there's some things that are interesting. Like for example, Yuria doesn't per se, for example, say that like if God exists, she's more like to the effect of whatever God is, sort of a very Thomas Aquinas type of like sort of like there was something that like created or gave man souls, and that thing is God. Is basically how she seems to be implying. And the general idea, like it's interesting how like Miyazaki has Urbane, who's like sort of the mainstream temple sort of kind of representative. Then you have Freck, who's sort of the immediate sort of like counterculture type of person who's like, no, all of this is all the criticism and the flaws. And then you have Yuria, who sort of serves as sort of the criticism of sort of Freck's idea of kind of tempering, like, like maybe like we shouldn't just kind of, go on like, let's just do whatever we want, like just take souls, become demons, like just like live kind of like doing like freely without any concern for the, the whole of the world and the community. Like maybe there's like a whole like maybe there is a purpose or something there, that a higher calling that we're supposed to like kind of think about.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting idea. And another thing that's actually interesting is that like Bjor, and this is more obvious in the Japanese script, is that like I like my first impression had been like the demons that you see like of like Penetrator and like all that, like they were actually demon, like the actual like war knights became the demons, and I don't know if that was yours too, but it's clear from like what Bjor's talking about is that those 3 black phantoms you fight have been there the whole time concurrent with the demons. So
Yeah.
it seems like it's more like something like the demons that and like even Bjor even acknowledges like this demon fake, like this is like kind of like this false like fake demon pretender of being a knight. So like he seems to even acknowledge that they may look like the knights that he's like his comrades, but they aren't. That seems to be the
I have that here in front of me. In the English version, he says blah 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 blah. Good work. How could a demon ever stand up to a bona fide knight? In the Japanese version, you've translated it as It was a demon sham against a true warrior, wasn't it?
The idea is like a sham, a fake, like sort of prop, like that type
Yeah.
of thing. Like, it's the same term used in Dark Souls 2 when describing, say, when Nashandra describes the dragon, the ancient dragon at the dragon shrine. It's sort of like, this kind of fake, sort of like this fake dragon. In fact, that's actually worth noting. Is like the final boss, King Allant, is actually, like, his actual original name is something like more like Allant the Failed to Be, because he failed to be a demon, and that's something that's made more explicit in the Japanese text and more direct to you. Now, I think most people pick up on it because visually you could kind of like connect the dots, but like that's something that's very straightforward, and that term is later used in Dark Souls when referring to failing to be dragons. Like almost every instance, like the Wretches of Irithel Dungeon, like there's that one enemy in Dark Souls 2 DLC, with like the tar, like the big teeth and things like that. Like all of these are enemies which are referred to as like Nari Sokonai, or failed to be. Like they failed to become, in the context of Dark Souls, dragons, but in the context of Demon Souls, it's Allant failing to become a demon. And then he creates like this false demon, and then apparently he created false demons for his knights too. And his knights are still like, you know what? We'll just become like, I don't know, like we're gonna like die and become dark spirits still serving you, my lord. Like I guess we're that loyal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically all the questions I had. That's all the sort of big things I noted that I got wrong. Was there anything else you noticed in the videos which,
No,
or any other big
all.
translation flaw?
No, I think so. Like I'm trying to think, like right now, like not like we could go like on the nitty gritty all day, but like like for the overview, no, that generally covers it. Like a lot of the stuff in Demon Souls, there's some areas which are of course more ambiguous than there was in the English script renders it, but there's a lot of stuff that's also less ambiguous than the English script renders it. Like I said, sometimes lines get forgotten. Yeah, sometimes styles get changed or completely flubbed. And those things they stack up, and they like you said, the Vinland thing, you didn't even want to touch it because it was something that was just so hard to decipher from what you could read in the localization script, but it's something that's very simple and very straightforward when you actually kind of know the original text. And the same is true for a lot of things. Some of this stuff is very small, and you're like Sultan of Chaos, Tyrant of Chaos. Like it's like it's not the biggest deal. But like I said, like when you get to stuff like the Vidlands, when you get to stuff like Astrea, when you get to stuff like Boletaria and Allant, when you get to stuff like Rydell or Rydell, however you want to say it, or you want to go to say like Latria and the Old Monk and the Queen, those are things that are very relevant, and these are things that hurt fans' understanding of the lore, and is something that this is something that I think fans should just generally keep in mind when you're dealing with foreign games, especially Japanese games, is that if there's something that doesn't make entire sense, don't be afraid to at least like have in the back of your head, maybe what I'm working with isn't a perfectly accurate script, and there may be something that I'm missing here.
Yeah. Not every Japanese game is Silent Hill 2, where the translator worked so closely with the developers.
Yeah. Well, one thing you have to keep in mind, especially like if you're someone like you're like for like a non-English speaker, and you're someone who's like working like outside, like that's not your first language, is that the games for localization seem to go, from what I've looked at in Bloodborne's localization, is it goes, they write the Japanese script, they give it to the English localizers, and they localize it, and then that English localized script gets handed off to all the other territories, and then that gets translated from there. So like,
yes, it's
you're having I mean, you can see the filter situation. Oh yeah, so like, oh boy. The only difference between the quality of the Demon Souls and Dark Souls scripts is the Dark Souls script got bigger. Oh boy. But don't worry, after the release of the wildly popular Dark Souls, for some reason, can't imagine why, the localizations start getting progressively better from that point on, at least with the Souls games.
Very weird.
Very strange. Very strange. Very strange. I'm very, very glad though. Hey.
Hi everyone, it's me again, wrapping this video up. I hope you've enjoyed my last foray into Demon Souls, unless the remake rumors are true, and I'd like to again direct you to the description box where I have links to relevant sites for this conversation, most importantly Lokey's Twitter account and translations. I really appreciate the insight those translations have given me on the game, and I hope that you're walking away from this video with a better understanding of Demon Souls yourself. It may have come across as a very negative look at Demon's Souls, but anyone who watched my previous videos on the game will know that I hold it in very high regard, and that's something which hasn't changed. Before signing off, I'd like to make a point which I didn't touch on in the conversation itself, which is that, as a whole, I think the translation is perfectly serviceable. There are moments where the point of the game is lost, but since Demon's Souls isn't solely reliant on text for its storytelling, a lot more of the experience made it in than didn't, and because of that, I think that the main narrative theme of the game still shines through. Anyway, the usual links are in the description if you're interested. Thanks for watching, and take care.